Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, as a little island between all the legal hectic cases of this week and before Parliament sits again next week, I thought I'd pick up on something that the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace was saying in regards the attitude of MPs in the British Parliament, which really do explain why it was that no compromise, if one were possible, were ever found for Brexit. But first, if you find yourself enjoying the video, then please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. So, Ben Wallace dropped a bit of a bollock yesterday when he was being interviewed about the prorogation. Was it yesterday? It might have been the day before, actually. And but since prorogation, at any rate, and in amongst all this, you know, he was really explaining that it was for Brexit purposes, which was very off message. But another thing he said, he was talking about, as for justification, our British political system. He said it doesn't really account for minority governments. It's a system where winner takes all. It's based on the idea of a party getting a majority and then it can carry through its legislation. And this really is at the crux of why we were never able to find a compromise, because first of all, it depends what he means by the system, actually, because it could be untrue. If what he means by the system is the parliamentary system in Westminster, then it's not at all true. It's absolute nonsense. In fact, our parliamentary system, from that point of view, is not really different to the parliamentary systems in countries around Europe, for example, where it is very, very common, in fact, almost exclusively the case, for no party ever to get an overall majority. And what do? They work with other parties. As soon as an election has taken place, they start to work out the parliamentary arithmetic, and coalitions, or just, you know, groups of loosely associated parties with agendas that they'll both agree on, start to get together. They start to work out, well, what can we agree to support and get through Parliament? That happens. Doesn't really happen in this country. And so if what he's talking is not so much the parliamentary system, but the party political system in this country, then he is on the money. It is really a winner takes all scenario. And we have to remember, for 7 of the last 9 years, we have had no party in overall control of government, of Parliament, no party that has had an overall majority. But it hasn't really caused these parties to start cooperating. And in fact, if there were a general election to take place later this year, it is, at the moment, it's not impossible because things can change. But at the moment, you can't really see any one party gaining a majority either. In fact, at the moment, you could almost imagine it would be impossible for any 2 parties even to have an overall majority. And I mean, that's almost been wiped out in this Parliament, come to think of it. But and that is because we have been used in British politics to either the Conservatives or the Labour government in modern times have won an overall majority, they form a government. And what that means is the Prime Minister then issues their legislative aims and they pretty much get away with them. Occasionally the government can be defeated. It's not unheard of, it happens, but it doesn't happen very often. So generally they'll get their manifesto pledges and they'll go or they'll pretend to go through them. Sometimes they're not actually honest about them, but if they are, they'll be able to get those through. They'll have other pieces of legislation they want to go through as well, and they'll get it through because they control, even if they have a few awkward backbenchers in their party, they usually got a majority large enough to take account of that. And that is why Theresa May, when Brexit happened, she had a majority when she became Prime Minister. She pissed it away with the general election. It wasn't out of vanity that she triggered a general election. It was because although she had a majority, it wasn't a large majority, and she had 80 ERG MPs in her party that she knew don't want a deal with the EU. She knew this. She couldn't say it publicly. That's why she went for a general election. She was hoping to get a large enough majority to be able to sideline them so that they couldn't be awkward about it. She wasn't expecting a majority of over 80, but even 50 would have been okay, because some of those ERG members she could have strong-armed into supporting her anyway, as we saw with the final vote, where even the likes of Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg were voting in favour of her deal. So but what you'll notice, at no point, as soon as she lost that majority, so she didn't get an increased majority, she actually lost what majority she had, Did she think to herself, right, what we need to do here, I can't get my deal through Parliament like this, I'm going to need to start to work with other parties? No, what she did is she bribed the DUP to give her a very tiny majority on only budget and confidence votes, and knowing full well that they didn't want, the deal that eventually emerged either, she didn't put any effort into trying to work with other parties. She pretended to towards the end, when she was basically being forced out of office anyway. And that is the thing, and that's the attitude we have. And it's not just the Conservatives. Those are the people who've espoused this attitude before. Labour have had the same attitude as well. Both of the big parties who are the ones who are more likely to work with others, of course, are the ones who never expect to get a majority. SNP, Plaid Cymru, Liberal Democrats, those, the Green Party, of course. Those are the ones who are willing to work with others, not just because there's something about those parties, but they will never get a majority, which means the only chance they ever have of ever influencing legislation is to work with others. So they're more like the parties in Europe that know they have no chance of forming a majority, so they know they have to cooperate. So it's natural to them. It's not natural to Conservative leaderships, and it's not natural to Labour leaderships. They have the attitude of, you must do what I say, because normally when their party is in government, that's what happens, and that's what can happen. It's not to say that they never work with other parties, but at the same time, they don't have to. But now they do. And this is ultimately why no compromise could ever have been found for Brexit, assuming it ever could. I mean, to a lot of people, it's fairly binary anyway. You're either in the EU or you're out of the EU. If you are the sort of person that's in favour of, for example, a no-deal Brexit, then it is very binary. That is not at all compatible with someone like me who wants to remain in the EU. Now, Theresa May thought she might have a compromise in a withdrawal agreement that didn't basically say anything. But it's not really. You could argue that actually what the Brexiteers were arguing before the referendum was a compromise, because you're not a member of the EU, but at the same time you are in all its systems. The problem with that is, although it sounds like a compromise, what they were actually espousing was a lie, because they were saying we'd be in all the EU systems, but we wouldn't have to follow any EU rules. Well, that's not true. So what they were offering sounds like a compromise, but it wasn't realistic. But there is a compromise potentially to have been had. Like, for example, if it was legally and democratically decided we'd be leaving the EU, I would accept, okay, but we still have to stay in the single market, and I still want the cooperation on security matters and travel, so that, so that we don't have delays that prevent goods coming into and out of the country and our businesses collapsing, and that we don't have criminals coming into the country that we can't see their records, making us a much less safe country because the police don't know who's coming into the country. I would accept that, but that was not possible because there was never any cross-party support, because Theresa May, even with a minority government, was behaving as if she had a majority government, whining at people when they didn't vote for her legislation, whining at Labour when dozens of her own MPs were voting against it. She was whining at Labour for not supporting it. And that's all there is to it. It's that tribal party politics, which makes, the big ones incapable of working with the other ones. I know David Cameron formed a coalition with the Lib Dems, which they bitterly regret now, in 2010. But even then, and that's why the Lib Dems suffered so much in 2015, because he still basically got his way. He got the Lib Dems to sign up for it, and he offered them, what did the Lib Dems get out of it? They got a referendum on a different electoral system, which they lost. And they got a right hammering in 2015. That was all they got for their troubles. Whereas David Cameron got to enact his legislation that he wanted to do. Carry on Thatcherism for another few years. So he still behaved even then as if he was a Prime Minister of a majority government, because he still got to push through all that legislation. He, strong-armed the Lib Dems into supporting it. And that is what it's like in this country. And I know, and it's sort of maddening to people who live in particularly European countries where cooperation has to be the order of the day. But we're much more like, in a way, the American system, where it's all very partisan, even though our parliamentary system doesn't force this to happen. This is just the attitudes we've had just because voters have tended to swing behind one or the other of the big parties. And for most of our lives, it's sort of worked out. But every now and then it doesn't. But this one is not so much the blip like we had in the 70s, for example, where there had to be a very short-lived coalition. This is lasting longer. And it may be that if it continues to last, that politicians eventually will catch up. They will eventually realise that what they have to do is to adapt. But that point hasn't been reached just yet. So hopefully that explains a few things. We'll be looking forward to next week, of course, where it is all going to kick off in Parliament. That starts from Tuesday afternoon. So hopefully I'll be able to report on that for next week. But other than that, have a good weekend. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did and you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.